and welcome everyone to today's edition of Russia and its Neighbors with Jill Dougherty. I'm looking forward very much to our conversation with Ambassador Spratlen. But my job here, I'm Michael David Fox. I'm the director of Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies here at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And my job here is very simple and pleasant. It's to introduce Jill Dougherty. Jill Dougherty is an adjunct professor at Ceres, and she is a journalist who has had extensive experience at CNN, both as White House correspondent, Moscow bureau chief, and she still is involved with CNN from time to time. And she has just finished a memoir about her own experiences in Russia. So, Jill, I'm handing it over to you.
Michael, thank you very much. And I have to say, this is the third in our series of episodes about Russia and its neighbors. It's a tour, so to speak, around the post-Soviet neighborhood, which has not been, sadly, looking very neighborly recently. Breaking news here, we have a really big turnout, which I think is testimony to Ambassador Spratlen and to the subject that we have, which is really a hot subject right now, Central Asia, with all of the ramifications of that. And just to kind of set the scene, and then we'll get into this, the subject is Russia and Central Asia. How Russia keeps its Central Asian neighbors close is the title that we dreamed up. And one way that Russia does that is with economic and security organizations that Russia itself has created to maintain what it calls its privileged sphere of influence. I think a lot of us know that phrase. So it's a very complex relationship. And then there's another neighbor involved, of course, and that is China. So we've got a lot to talk about. And to help us understand these dynamics, our guest today is Ambassador Pamela Spratlen. Ambassador Spratlen served for nearly 3 decades, 1990 to 2019, as a career member of the U.S. Foreign Service. And she has a really interesting broad background in the Foreign Service. Her overseas tours included Latin America, Western Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. I'm not quite sure what's left in the world after that, but she also served as U.S. ambassador to the Kyrgyz Republic and to Uzbekistan. So she really knows her brief. And welcome, Ambassador Spratlen.
Well, thank you very much, both to Michael and to you, Jill. I very much appreciate the introduction and also the opportunity to be with you and your guests. So I look forward to the discussion.
I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion. And just kind of a little housekeeping, Ambassador Spratlen and I will talk for, let's say, 25, 30 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions. But in advance, you can put those questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the page, and we'll be watching those as we go along. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. So diving in here, in talking about Central Asia, and I think everybody probably on this call knows, we're talking about a huge swath of territory. Just Kazakhstan alone, the world's 9th largest country. And it has, I looked it up, 1,052,000 square miles. And that's just one country. Now, in other post-Soviet neighborhoods, the residents that we've been talking about in our previous episodes really have no interest in continuing much of an alliance with Russia. But these now independent countries in Central Asia actually do. And why they do is one of the questions that I have. So maybe we'll start with that, Ambassador Spratlen. Why do these countries of Central Asia, now independent, continue to have these alliances, which are both economic and security with Moscow?
Well, thank you very much. It's a great question, and I think its roots are in sort of history, because the countries of Central Asia were not countries prior to them being made republics of the former Soviet Union in the 20s. And then when the collapse came in 1991, they became independent states. So they know very well Russia, and this all followed a very long period of Russian annexation and so on during the imperial period. And so the Central Asian states, which are mainly Turkic, with the exception of Tajikistan, have had very many years, decades, to get to know the Russian Federation for good and for ill. And I would say that, better the person than anything else. They all developed a great deal during the former Soviet period, which the Soviets brought literacy, the Soviets brought electrification, the Soviets brought a connection to a larger world that had previously been a reality for them. So there were some benefits. And these countries were not seeking the collapse of the former Soviet Union. This was something that they had to adapt to. Now that they have the opportunity, of course, they want to take full advantage of their independence, their territorial integrity, and their sovereignty, and trying to find ways to do that and yet retain the ties that are useful to Moscow and to Russia is something that they are all doing. Most of them, and you're just naming them, you mentioned Kazakhstan, which is geographically the largest, but actually in terms of the number of people living there, when you have between 17 and 20 million people for a landmass that big, that's really quite extraordinary. It's actually Uzbekistan that has the largest population, some 37 million people, and it's the one that's sort of filling the donut hole of Central Asia. Then we have the Kyrgyz Republic there on the border of China. We have Tajikistan, which is the one whose language is Persian. And then we have Turkmenistan, which is the most, I would say, isolated of all the Central Asian states. So, and those 5 countries, even though we tend to lump them together in our minds, don't necessarily, have not always seen themselves as lumped together. So and now with 30 years more and more of sovereignty, they're developing on their own paths, but they need those and want those relationships with Russia, of course, on their own terms if they can get it, for the economic benefits that come with that, the historical benefits that come with that, sometimes the cultural benefits that come with that, and most importantly, I think the foreign policy balancing benefits that come with that. We often hear about a multi-vector foreign policy. Kazakhstan, I think, especially uses that phrase. And what they mean by that is they want to take the very best of every diplomatic relationship they can, since they live in a geographically isolated part of the world. And so I can't imagine really a way in which they could be truly viable without some kind of relationship with Russia. And now as China's influence grows, it gives them an opportunity to balance the two as they also begin to figure out where the advantages and disadvantages are of cooperating more closely together. So it's a kind of long-winded answer to say that there are benefits to them for maintaining this relationship, and their hostility to Russia in the way that, say, Ukraine would have just isn't there. I mean, just think of geography. Ukraine is a nation that has staked its future on the fact that it has options. No, those aren't options that Russia wants to allow them to exercise, but those options are not available, even to a very well-developed nation like Kazakhstan. They aren't likely to become members of the European Union. The geography isn't there, the culture isn't there. So many aspects that would be necessary for the European Union membership are just not there, whereas they are for some of the other nations that want to take full advantage of what they see as greener pastures. In some ways, for the nations of Central Asia, Russia is about as green as it's going to get as a pasture. So in some fields. And so that is something they try to take advantage of to the best of their ability, understanding that they want their independence and their sovereignty and their territorial integrity.
That is a great introduction, really. Actually, you kind of opened my eyes. I like your focus on history very much. And just, a little kind of subtext here. I was thinking, as you said, they are isolated geographically, but they're also the former Silk Route.
That's
You know,
right.
so they
Mhm.
were this area that maybe people didn't stop along the way necessarily, but there was movement, from east to west. Could you just, like 2 minutes, kind of give us that perspective as well? Because they are a crucial part of world history, trade, cultural expansion, et cetera.
Well, yes, the Silk Road lasted for centuries, and it was the way that goods, people, and ideas moved from China to the Mediterranean in Europe for many, many years until more modern technology made different routes possible. And the countries of Central Asia were very much a part of that, especially Uzbekistan, but really all of them. And as a matter of fact, the US tourism industry has taken advantage of this, and you can now, you take trips that refer to the Silk Road and that stop in all 5 countries of Central Asia. I was just on one of these trips with the Smithsonian Journeys, and see the architectural legacy, which is incredible, the intellectual legacy through the madrasas that were left. You can see the trade and the innovation that took place along this route for many, many years. And so some of them were more involved in the Silk Road than others. As I said, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan especially, Kyrgyzstan to a slightly lesser degree, but even there are elements of that same transit to and from. And what was left from that, I think, is this idea of an open space. We tend to think of the countries of Central Asia as being closed, as not always, but I think that there are some more recent historical reasons for that. But during the Silk Road time, they came to be known as very welcoming people, as people who were receptive to different people and ideas. And I think that that's one of the legacies that I frequently heard about when I was in Central Asia, about the legacy of the region. But at the same time, the trade started to slow down, and there were all of this good stuff was punctuated by a lot of violence at the same time, as different tribes and so on swooped in, and there would be changes in leadership. So it was not an easy path during those many centuries of the Silk Road, and it's not an easy path now. But the adaptability of these countries, the ability to accept the stranger, I think all those things have been very positive for Central Asia, and they're trying to take advantage of it now.
Yeah. Well, to bring us up to the present, one of the things that we wanted to look at was the way that Russia, even after the end of the Soviet Union, continues to try to keep those neighbors close. And a couple of things that I thought we would focus on are the 2 most important organizations in that region. And that would be the CSTO, Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is security. And then the other one, the Eurasian Economic Union, which obviously focuses on the economic relationship among those countries. Now, so I'm just going to jump in here 2 seconds. CSTO,
Sure.
I had to remind myself, interestingly includes, I believe this is still the case, Armenia, Belarus, not Central Asia, and then Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Tajikistan. And it's a military alliance created in 2002. Then you have the Eurasian Economic Union. But why don't we start with CSTO? What is the purpose of it? Why do we have countries like Belarus in there? Because they're not part of the neighborhood. And then also, what are the advantages and maybe disadvantages to the countries that are part of it?
Well, Jill, I want to actually take a step back to the umbrella organization over both the CSTO and the Eurasian Economic Union, and that is the Commonwealth of Independent States, which was the legal successor to the USSR. Both of the organizations that you've mentioned come under, in a technical legal way, the Commonwealth of Independent States, which, just to review, includes Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, which was a founder and has the headquarters. Georgia withdrew in 2008-9. Kazakhstan is a founder. Moldova, the Russian Federation, also a founder. Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, which is an interesting case, and Uzbekistan. Of course, Ukraine withdrew in 2014. Mongolia is an observer, and the Baltic states were never a part of it. But I think it's interesting to start there because you're talking about what did Russia do to try to recoup something of all that was lost with the collapse of the former Soviet Union, since it still saw itself and sees itself as a global power. So how is it going to make that status meaningful, since it valued these countries in its near abroad and wanted to be sure that Russia felt safe? And so starting just with this top umbrella, it started to build I would say that the CSTO and the Eurasian Economic Union, which came much later. Eurasian Economic Union started with an idea from President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan in 1994, but it was in 2015 that it really became a reality, whereas the CSTO started much earlier. And then you have a country like so basically, this architecture is a way for Russia to still be relevant and meaningful, and not only to keep its neighbors close as the most powerful person in all of this, but also, in order to keep them close, knowing that people have some options, to offer something. And so that's what I think both the CSTO and the Eurasian Economic Union ostensibly did. For the Eurasian Economic Union, I think there was also this idea that, okay, there's the EU for some of the former Soviet states, and there's a debate, certainly in Moscow, about how is the integration of the eastern part of Europe going to be managed? And Russia wants a say in that. And having its own instruments, I would say, in some ways, they probably thought gave them a larger say in how this integration process was going to go. So the idea for both of these entities, as you say, CSTO for security and the Eurasian Economic Union for economics, was not only to keep the neighbors close, but also to give them a way of actually engaging with people. So I think it was all of that that helped create both the CIS, especially that was a part of it, but then underneath it, the CSTO and the Eurasian Economic Union later.
Is it fair to say that the CSTO is their version of NATO?
I'm not sure anybody in NATO would say that would be fair. I would say that if you're in Moscow, perhaps that was the thinking. But the countries of NATO, it's certainly clear that the United States is the largest member and has the most military resources of anybody. But over the last few years, there's been this discussion of the Europeans providing more for this collective defense. In the case of the CSTO, really the only meaningful military is Russia. And the rest of them really don't have. So a military alliance without militaries, and that are truly meaning, I don't know that one could say that that would be a counterpart to NATO. But certainly in terms of the thinking of the purpose of it and the idea of it, yes, there are military drills. They have conversations about security. So in that sense, yes. But I think what's been challenging is that the CSTO has been tested over time, and it has not always, sometimes it has worked, but sometimes not so much. And so I think it's still evolving what the CSTO is actually going to be. If you look at the press, for the people who are more expert on this than I am, you will see some pretty harsh criticisms of the CSTO, calling it symbolic, calling it just a hollow alliance. And there are some pretty strong arguments about that. But certainly, what does Russia intend? I think it intends for it to be a very serious military alliance, and it's working hard to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. We have, let's see, we have about maybe 10 more minutes. We'll chat. But I'm urging people, because I'm sure there are a lot of questions by now, put them in the Q&A, and we will get to them in about 10 minutes. I wanted to pick up Ambassador Spratlen with this issue. We've kind of mentioned China, but I think it's now time to mention China. And maybe, as you told me in another conversation previously, Turkey, because these are Turkic-speaking areas, but especially China. China obviously is expanding its role in Central Asia, especially in the energy sphere, because these countries produce a lot of energy, especially gas. I saw a figure, which I think is the latest, Chinese trade with the region now stands at $90 billion, which just outstrips Russia's trade with the region. So what I'm interested in is they are, in a sense, Russia and China are, in a sense, competitors, but as we know, they're best friends, a limitless partnership without limits. So how do they work that out in Central Asia, where these issues really come to the fore?
Well, it's an excellent question, and I would say it's still being answered. There's no definitive answer to it yet. But what is happening, I think we can see it every day, is that Russia is under a lot of pressure. The decision to go in and invade Ukraine with its, which was illegal and inappropriate, but it takes a lot of resources to manage that. At the same time, we know that all over the world, not just in Central Asia, China is becoming a more and more important player. It figured prominently in our presidential debate. It's something that's happening all over the world, even places like Africa, which we in the past did not think of as places where China would be very, very active. Over the last 10, 15 years, they've become extremely active there. And so what we're seeing in Central Asia is just a mirror of what we're seeing all over the world. And I think the Central Asian states, going back to their geography, of course, they're right next to China, especially Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, quite literally. And so they need a relationship. And there's a lot to take advantage of, because the Chinese, as they are doing all over the world, are going and offering all kinds of benefits with trade, with infrastructure, but also with education, with culture. And so what the Central Asian states need, because they're small and because they are comparatively not as rich, they need options. They need the ability to counter Russia, but they also need to take advantage of what China is offering. It was the Russians who built the first the Trans-Siberian Railroad, but now China is involved in railroad building. And so I think they see this as an opportunity to gain some things. But in order to avoid the challenge of being inundated or overwhelmed by what the Chinese can bring, they need options. And so that's, I think, why their interest in Russia, or one of the reasons why their interest in Russia continues. But I would say that this is only going to grow. This is only going to grow over time. And Russia and China, yes, as you said, they have a friendship without limits. It does have some limits. And in some ways, I think what has happened is that China's presence has in some ways checked Russia a little bit. And I'm trying to think of a specific example of that. But I think just having more than one player, and especially knowing that China, which used to be, as Michael well knows, China used to be the little brother. And now very much there's been a switch. And China is now emerging as the larger player with more resources, more options, more capabilities, but at the same time, it has absolutely no interest in completely destroying Russia. They have a shared sense of what governance looks like. They have a shared history. And so they're going to work together. I would say for the moment, Russia is slightly more involved in the security side of things, and we've seen a few examples of that. And China, because of its vast resources, is taking more of a role in the economy and the infrastructure, the development of the various resources that are available in that part of the world. But there's, a lot to go around, and I think there's no reason to believe that they will come to any conflict. They have a lot of shared interest in seeing that they and not any other become the ones who are dominant in that particular part of the world. You asked about Turkey a moment ago, and I just wanted to say that Turkey is a country that for a long time has had an interest in Central Asia, mostly because of the cultural feature, the Islam, both Islamic countries, Central Asian countries and Turkey, but also for trade and for cultural reasons. And the Turks tried at the very beginning of the collapse of the former Soviet Union to come in and develop relationships with the Central Asian states. And unfortunately, some of their tactics, which were seen as a little bit overbearing, didn't go over well. And so this is sort of 2.0 for the Turks. And there was recently actually a summit where they started, they talked about having a common alphabet based on Latin letters as opposed to Cyrillic ones. And so that's just a small example of where Turkey or another country is trying to find advantage. But your question is about the relationship between Russia and China, and that's where the greatest scope for, I think, cooperation exists.
You know, I see quite a few questions. Michael, I just wanted to see whether you want to jump in here or should we go to questions? You have a
Well, I do have a question, if you don't mind, because it'll frame some of the questions that are, I think, in the chat, which are a little more specific. But I mean, China is definitely the big brother economically, but in terms of Central Asia, Russia still sees this very much as its own backyard and
That's right.
sphere of influence. So, and one could talk about the frictions there, but my question would be like, let's say we look at Russia's relationship with Central Asia, and we look at, say, the things it has going for it and the things it has working against it. You could construct a whole list or typology, but in terms of what it has going for it, not just the historical ties among elites, but also the amount of education that elites and even like secret services, right? They have
Mhm.
such close ties with the FSB in terms of networks and education.
Right.
But also the media, right? That Russia is really good at disinformation, at getting its
Yes.
message out there. And, there's so many Russophones and there's so many people going to Russia to work and sending remittances. So there are all these
Right.
kind of levers that Russia has.
That's
But then
right.
on the other side of the, ledger, one could point to more and more people going to study in China. One could talk to the Central Asian states kind of cooperating more in the wake of Ukraine, right? And just Russia's reputation after the war in Ukraine is seems to be really pushing those states to away from Russia. So I just wonder where you see the balance, and the pluses and minuses.
I would agree with everything that that you just said. I think there is great concern. There was great concern at the moment that going all the way back to 2014 with respect to Ukraine, but certainly in 2022 when Russia made the decision to actually invade, I think it was a real wake-up call for everybody. And that's why, just going back to the issue of the CSTO and this whole business of balancing, the fact of the matter is that Kazakhstan, a member of the CSTO, did call on the CSTO to come in when there was unrest in Almaty in 2022. Now, one could say, oh my goodness, this was a terrible thing. And I do remember reading some of the commentary at the time that this was a very bad idea, that this was going to be like Afghanistan. They would come and they would never leave. As a matter of fact, they were involved in what some are saying were pretty symbolic things. Not a single shot was fired. Maybe they had some troops standing by. Mostly it was Russian. They came on January 5th. They left on January 11th. And it actually, I think, helped. It helped the then President Tokayev kind of solidify things and reassure everybody that there was more stability. And it gave both Kazakhstan and Russia, which were members of the CSTO, an example of something that they had done effectively. Now, as a matter of fact, it was pretty cosmetic as an operation. But still, I think it shows that even when there's worry about what the Russians are doing, even when there's a concern that they have overreached and overstepped, I don't see that partnership ever really going away. They're going to find a way to make it work. But being really clear, as Tokayev was, that just as they had the support of the CSTO when it came to the invasion of Ukraine, the Kazakhs were very clear that they did not support it, and none of the countries have been supportive. Interesting that even as early as or about a year ago, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov went to Tajikistan to try to get them to join the Eurasian Economic Union. They're already members of the CSTO and they host a Russian base there. And, Imamoli Rahmon, the president, was very polite, but that hasn't happened. So I think that you're right that this is a delicate balance and Russia's behavior has kind of changed the mood. But I would say the fundamental structures of cooperation are there. And the real need for cooperation is there. Especially when you think of something like the indebtedness of a country like Tajikistan, which owes billions of dollars to China. What are they relying on? Well, probably at some point, who's going to bail them out? They may need some help from Russia. So it's a complex picture, but I do think that it's one that will continue to involve both cooperation and hesitancy on the part of the countries of Central Asia with respect to Russia. The relationships, for all the reasons you mentioned, are just too deep. I remember just a little anecdote when I was in the Kyrgyz Republic. There was a businesswoman. She was very, very effective. And she had 3 children. And she was sending one to China for college, one to Russia, and one to Canada. Now that's hedging, trying to make sure that you've got your bases covered. That's just one example. But I think they're trying to figure out how are we going to live in this world as it evolves.
Fascinating. I'm really glad. Wow, we've got quite a few questions here. And obviously from people who know Central Asia, which is really fantastic. So I'm just going to grab a couple here. Let's start with the first person who jumped in, Davin Knapp. And thank you so much for speaking with us. Excuse me, Ambassador Spratlen. Recently, Armenia announced its intention to leave the CSTO. What do you think this indicates for the organization's future?
Well, it's interesting. As far as I know, that announcement was made by Prime Minister Pashinyan in June of this year. But to my knowledge, it hasn't been acted on. And so I'm not sure how to interpret it. I think he was definitely sending a signal about his unhappiness. He actually tried to get support from the CSTO with respect to their long-standing challenges with Azerbaijan, and that wasn't offered. And so I think there was a great deal of pique in Armenia that, hey, we're CSTO members, we expect to get some benefits from that, where's the help? It didn't happen. And that wasn't the first time. The same thing happened to Rosa Otunbayeva in Central Asia in 2010 when there was unrest and no help. So I think that Pashinyan was simply publicly expressing at a very high level for Armenia his extreme unhappiness with the CSTO and its failure to come in as a partner. Yet at the same time, the fact that this has been slow rolled a bit, nothing specific has happened to my knowledge, says not that there's necessarily hesitation about it, but that it's unclear what it might mean either for Armenia or for the CSTO as an alliance as a whole.
I want to jump down to a question that's kind of related. This is from Evan McDonnell. Is the CSTO still viable after the invasion of Ukraine? How does CSTO's failure to intervene in Nagorno-Karabakh in 2023 affect the future of the alliance?
Well, unfortunately, quite unfortunately, the horrible war continues in Ukraine. It's just so tragic and it's so brutal. But I think because we don't know the outcome, it's impossible to say what it might mean for the future of the alliance. It's interesting that the support for Kazakhstan on the CSTO happened just a month before, in January of 22, and then the Russians went in February into Ukraine. I can't imagine, given all the ravages of this war, that it would help the alliance. Certainly doesn't help Russia's reputation. And the reality, it's taking a lot of weapons, it's taking a lot of resources and putting them not in to fight an external threat, but to deal with a sort of semi-internal, semi-external kind of challenge. I just can't imagine that that would be positive for the alliance. But I also know, as Michael has pointed out, that the disinformation machine works overtime. And so there will be some way to spin this and frame this as, I wouldn't say necessarily a success, but something that doesn't necessarily harm the future of the alliance. It's important to remember that this isn't just a military alliance, the CSTO. It's also a political kind of organization, a group of countries that are, quote unquote, not necessarily in the case of Armenia, always like-minded, but see the world in similar ways. So my bottom line answer is it's just too soon to tell. We need to figure out how the conflict in Ukraine actually ends. Could some other horrific conflict actually arise, hard as that might be to imagine? Or would Russia manage to put together some sort of scruffy force if there was a need to go in somewhere else? They've been very selective about what the CSTO actually does. So I would say there are just many reasons why we can't really know right at the moment what the future will be. Eh, but certainly this conflict can't help build either the overall quality of the alliance as a fighting force, or its reputation as a supporter of even its own member states. So yes, I think it's a challenge, but it's unclear whether it will be an end of the road challenge or not for the CSTO.
Hmm. You know, there are two questions here that are kind of allied. So one is anonymous, and the other one is from Ani Tanayan. First one, is it possible for Central Asian countries to achieve political independence considering their proximity to China and Russia? What practices or models could they consider? And then the other one is kind of similar. What does a relationship with China mean for Central Asian people? Will there be more or less freedom as a result? So both of those, you know, dealing with the I guess, you know, what can they, if they're related or they have this relationship with Russia and China, how do they have any type of independence, you know?
Well, independence is definitely something that, and Jill, let me just stop here as I'm answering questions and clarify for people that I'm very much a retired ambassador and I am in no way speaking for or on behalf of the US government. I
Gotcha.
left the region officially 5 years ago, and a lot of things have changed since I left. So I'm happy to be talking to you, but I need to be clear that I'm speaking personally.
Understood.
Um, the issue of independence is definitely a challenging one for the Central Asian countries. Just taking the case of Kazakhstan, which has the most resources to express its independence. Its economy is big. Russia very much values its partnership with Kazakhstan, but they also share a very long border together. And from time to time, usually it's in the Duma, you'll hear somebody, or in the press, somebody talk about, well, maybe we should start looking at, going back and claiming something or other, and just sending a little, tweet bomb that, please remember Kazakhstan, that, where you live. So I think that's a sort of structural reality for Kazakhstan, and that will always be true. But at the same time, I think Kazakhstan has done really probably the best job of all the Central Asians of creating a society that can stand more or less on its own. It can educate its own elite at this point, thanks to Nazarbayev University and a few other things. Not that they don't send plenty of people to Russia and abroad, but they have built up an infrastructure that allows them to train their own talent. They have brought in people who've made their corporations stronger, so they're able to manage that whole piece on their own. They've gotten better and better at managing their main resource, which is oil, on their own. So they will always want cooperation, and I think having cooperation with a wide variety of players in different spheres is one way that Kazakhstan protects its independence. And also having shrewd leadership. I think for many years, President Nazarbayev was greatly criticized, and quite legitimately so, for many of the aspects of the sort of political side of Kazakhstan's development or lack thereof. But on the economic side, I think we can only have admiration for what he actually built. And now with this transition, which actually did happen, they've managed to sustain that. So I think, because again, they can't change their address, they can't change their neighborhood, they have to work with what they have. But as long as they are able to manage the internal development of the country in a stable way, then I think they have the greatest chance of managing it with both Russia and with China. So I think they're kind of a model in many, many ways of what independence can look like. And I think we have to all understand that it's still going to mean a great deal of cooperation with both Russia and China Potentially others as well, but those two will be the largest ones. So for the other countries, they define independence differently. Let's take Turkmenistan, for example. Turkmenistan is a much smaller country. It has a population of between 5 and 6 million people. Its great resource is gas. And it has a challenging neighborhood because we haven't even talked about Iran. That is one of the countries that it borders. So how has Turkmenistan dealt with the idea of expressing independence? Well, some of it is by having leadership that is not so easy to cooperate with, but also this long-term policy that they have had that they call positive neutrality. And what does that mean? It means that they're very, very selective about the kinds of organizations they join. They will do things with the United Nations. I was looking recently because I had to give a presentation, and I looked for a picture of the president by himself, and the only one I could find was with him and a UN official. So they very much value the relationship they have with the UN, but they're extremely careful about all the other things that they do. So for example, they are what's called an associate member of the CIS. So the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, claims them, but they don't necessarily see themselves as a member of the organization because in positive neutrality, they don't join things. So they're not members of the CSTO, and I don't see them ever joining the Eurasian Economic Union. I would say by keeping that sort of autarkic attitude, they are trying to preserve their own independence. And so far, they've managed to do it pretty well. They've only recently started allowing some tourism, but it is one of the most isolated countries in the world. So I would say that each one of the Central Asian states has its own style of trying to protect its independence, understanding the reality of where they are actually located. In some ways, the relationships that they've had with each other have also helped. Sometimes they haven't gotten along so well. They're doing much better now. But I would say one of the things they know they have to be shrewd about, because they've worked so hard to become countries and to be independent states in the UN system, is to find ways to express that independence, and they each choose different ways of doing that.
Speaking of which, there's a question from Roxana Gabidulina,
Mm-hmm.
and it's pretty specific, but it kind of gets into that area. Given your expertise in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, what were the discussions regarding the advantages and disadvantages in these countries surrounding membership in the, I guess, Eurasian
Economic Union.
Kyrgyzstan ended up joining, whereas Uzbekistan has resisted joining, electing instead to remain an observer. In your estimation, has the cost or have the costs of joining paid off for Kyrgyzstan, or has Uzbekistan approach been validated these past few years?
Well, it's an excellent question. And for her, I'm going to refer her to a paper that I used as I was thinking about this, that was done by the OSCE Academy in Bishkek. And it actually deals with this specific question of whether or not the Eurasian Economic Union has been good for Kyrgyzstan. We'll talk about Uzbekistan in a minute. And what the conclusion of the author is that it is a partnership, yes, and there have been some advantages, yes, but there have also been some obstacles, and not necessarily all because of the Eurasian Economic Union. Some of those have to do with Kyrgyzstan and its lack of resources or ability to actually take advantage of everything on its own. What's interesting also about the Kyrgyzstan case is that this happened, the joining in 2015, after a long period of really a very different approach. When Kyrgyzstan became an independent state in 1991, the first president, Oscar Akayev, a physicist, was somebody who was very much lionized by the West. And he actually still lives in Moscow and teaches there. But he was able to get lots of benefits for the Kyrgyz Republic, including WTO membership. And that's been a little bit of an irritant with Kazakhstan with the resale of Chinese goods sometimes. But one of the things that they were trying to do, what they realized over time, is Kyrgyzstan is just hemorrhaging people because they can't figure out a way to build an economy that's sustainable, very highly dependent on agriculture, not always the best economic management, a very small country. And so I think in the end, the leadership of the country decided that, no, we just need to throw in our lot with Russia. And I certainly understood that because I was the ambassador when they told us that we were not going to be able to sustain our transit center at the Manas International Airport. And so what has happened is that the Kyrgyz have received some benefits from joining the Eurasian Economic Union. For a while, their trade went up, but then, just things have been kind of settling economically, and they haven't had all the economic benefits they had hoped for. But there are also some integration. They've not been able to meet all of the demands with respect to the requirements, phytosanitary and so on, that would make them members in good standing of the Eurasian Economic Union and therefore be able to take more advantage of some of the benefits. So it's been a mixed bag for them, but I think they thought they didn't really have too many other choices. For Uzbekistan, I think it's a little bit different because it comes partly out of the way they were managed early on. They took not quite as extreme as Turkmenistan an approach to managing their economic affairs, but President Karimov, their first president, saw himself as an economist. And he actually did weather the 2008 crisis reasonably well because they were so isolated from the rest of the world. And so I think in many ways, as the country with the largest population, a country with some resources, Uzbekistan is trying, not to the degree of President Karimov, but to find its own way and to reduce its dependence. With respect to the CSTO, they were members. They left in '99, and then some events took place inside of Uzbekistan that caused the entire world to be horrified by their human rights record. And they saw that, hey, we better stick to the friends we know. And so they joined again in 2006. But then in 2012, they suspended their membership and they have not gone back. So I think it's trying to figure out what puts my country in the best position. And they join or sign up when they think it's advantageous and pull away if they think it's not. And I think that Uzbekistan has just not seen the case yet for the Eurasian Economic Union. And it's true that most of the trade there is Russia. And so I don't think it's yet seen as strong a union as it needs to be for a country like Uzbekistan to join it. Someday they might, but it's not true today.
So there are a couple more questions. One is about Ukraine and Russia, but I think maybe we'll save that for another discussion.
Sure.
Which of course will be a very long discussion, I'm sure. But we have another question from Roxana Gabidulina. And this is kind of a question that I often ask when I'm doing like interviews. Is there something that I'm missing or that you would flag that we should look at? And it's a great question. She says, is there a Russia Central Asian dynamic that you think is either misunderstood or undercovered in the media, perhaps even in academic spaces, and that's worth paying attention to?
Well, it's a very good question. And I would say it's in some ways embedded in the question you ask. And that, going back, which is why would the countries of Central Asia want a relationship with Russia? And I think implicit in that is they shouldn't. That Russia is not a reliable partner. Russia is a country doing dastardly things in the world. Shouldn't everybody be trying to run as far away from Russia as they can? And I think it is important just to remember that there are all kinds of elements of cooperation. And I don't necessarily think it's missed, but because I think people nowadays are so focused on all the terrible things Russia is doing, all the reasons nobody would want to have cooperation with them. But it's easy to forget that in spite of everything, the Russian language is the lingua franca in Central Asia. In spite of everything, there's still a lot of people sending their kids to Russia to learn the language or go to school, build connections, and then come back. At the lower end of the education scale, Russia is still that release valve for Central Asia, especially for Uzbekistan and the Kyrgyz Republic and Tajikistan. They simply cannot mount an economic program inside the country that absorbs all of that youth. These are very young countries. And so they need that Russian escape valve in order to get the remittances and in order to keep the peace. So I think there are many reasons why a country would say yes, even in a situation that's really difficult. And I do think that's something that people need to remember. that in looking at the situation with the Russian Federation and the Central Asian states, you have to look at the whole picture. Of course, they want to be independent. Of course, they sometimes are quite irritated with the way that Russia behaves or tries to push them around. But at the same time, there are benefits that they get from this relationship, and they are always worried about the challenge of China. So there are many reasons why they would want this kind of cooperation. So I think that is something that scholars need to keep in mind as they're looking at the future of these alliances. I just don't see a case for abandoning Russia in Central Asia. I just don't see at this point that those states would be viable without those, completely viable without those relationships.
You know, we have 10 minutes left, 9 minutes. And I'm thinking maybe we actually could grab a little bit of that question about Donald Trump, because, you know, the question we haven't gotten into, and it's not really the question, but it's what does the United States do about Central Asia? What has it done? What's the policy? You know, we have an outgoing president and maybe, I don't know, an outgoing policy, but just kind of in general terms, as you look at this, Ambassador Spratlen, do you see, I guess it's a two-part question, has the United States paid enough attention to Central Asia? You obviously, you know.
Well, I'm going to say no as a former ambassador.
Well, that's what I'd love to hear. So, hey, it hasn't. Okay, so let's discuss that. And then also in this, you know, welter of all sorts of issues that we're going to get into in January, but China's a big issue. No question. You know, Iran will be a big issue, et cetera. Where are we going with this? So let's start with your thesis that the United States has not paid enough attention, and then maybe give us a little, in the remaining like 8 minutes, a little preview of what you think may be coming down the pike.
Okay, well, you know, of course, I said it somewhat facetiously, but I do think that it's important for the United States to keep an eye on this. For many, many years, the prism through which we viewed Central Asia was Afghanistan. So one of the things I didn't get to mention at the beginning is I think there are really 5 things that have really changed since I left. And one of them is the most important, the departure of the United States from Afghanistan, because what that did was it really changed how we focus on Central Asia. For many, many years, I remember talking to my old boss, Evan Feigenbaum, when he was the DAS, the sort of first level policy official for Central Asia, was wanting to deal with Central Asia on its own. There were many pros for the United States, but we could never get to that because we always wanted to do the thing that was important to us, of course, and that was security, that was anti-terrorism, that was working on Afghanistan. And we needed to get the support of the Central Asians to do various things. And then, oof, 2021 comes and we're no longer there. So do we need those relationships? What about the continuing, you know, challenge for Central Asia, since we'd had this mantra for years about the problem of terrorism coming over various borders, and we needed to work together on the issue of security. So I think figuring out what is the residue of all that, what is left from all of that, and then what is the hook of the United States for its involvement in the Central Asian space, because between Afghanistan and the oil and gas resources, that really consumed a lot of it. Now we're seeing a little bit of diversification, not that much, but a little bit of diversification in oil and gas, but the Afghanistan piece is really not there in the same way. So I think that's a really an open question. I think another issue that really has changed is the rise of China, and you've asked a little bit about that. I do think that's a big, big question. Of course, people could see it coming. When I was there, people talked about it all the time. A third thing that is more cultural, and I think that is the issue of religion. When I was there, there was still a lot of focus on, and they felt they weren't getting enough credit for being tolerant societies that, well, you know, were willing to have lots of people there. That was true, and it was not true for various reasons. But what I'm surprised by, having been to the region this fall and last fall, is the visible changes from Islam. And the relationships with the Gulf states that are also coming on. I'm giving resources to build mosques and seeing women who are covered, And what does all that actually mean? Is there more Arabic being taught? Who knows what that actually means for the future. I think a fourth thing is that there is greater cooperation between all of the states. And I think that's necessary because of the fifth change, which is that the complex of organizations that make up the multilateral space are really different. Your original basis for this whole program was to talk about those Russian-sponsored organizations under the aegis of the CIS, the CSTO, and the Eurasian Economic Union. But now we are seeing the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which we haven't really even talked about. Belt and Road is really not an initiative in the multilateral sense. That is a Chinese project, but it's extremely important and it is influencing so many different things. But that's not the only one. I already mentioned the issue of the Turkish organization, which is a small influence. But I think the big one is BRICS. And that is interesting. At the summit in Kazan, the Central Asian presidents were invited. And so there is a picture online of all of them there. Why Russia? Oh, yeah, but I think for Russia to signal, we have other people who in the future might be possible members of BRICS. And again, because the whole idea of BRICS is to establish institutions and to move in a direction that doesn't support necessarily the order that the United States has created and tried to develop for the last 70, 80 years, I think that is something that's very much worth watching in terms of what's going to happen. Now, in terms of the United States, I think all of those are reasons why the United States needs to have some attention paid to Central Asia, and I think we have done better. I do give the Biden administration credit for having a good strategy on Central Asia. And I give President Biden great credit for having met with all of the Central Asian states in the 2023 UN General Assembly under the aegis of the C5, what's called the C5+1, which is the Central Asian 5 states plus the United States, and still using that as a platform to try to build more cooperation with the countries of Central Asia, which very much value their relationship with the United States. Of course, they don't like what they consider to be the hectoring about human rights and so on. There may be less of that in the future from the United States, but and the rule of law and anti-corruption and so on. They haven't so much appreciated that. But the relationship itself is important to them. They would like to see greater investment on the part of U.S. firms. They greatly appreciate the fact that we have a slow, long, quiet, steady presence there in the form of our embassies, which are often large and very active. We have excellent ambassadors in the region. I'm so glad we now have an ambassador in Turkmenistan, which we didn't have for a very long time. So I think at a minimum, the United States needs to keep up the efforts that it's undertaken. And I hope even in this sort of anything you did, I don't like kind of approach is not helpful for the United States, because these are countries that bank on stability and relationship building. And so we need to think about what is American that we can really sustain over time. So I think that's important. Business, I think that, the businesses are going to go where they see advantage. And just in terms of security, they also need that relationship with the United States, just to know that we have our eye on the situation and what is going on. So I see the United States as a very important actor for balancing alone. And I think there's not a country in Central Asia that doesn't value that relationship and doesn't want to see it grow. Of course, every single country in Central Asia would love it to have a presidential visit. They've been talking about it for over 3 years, and they would love to have it happen, just to show that they matter and that they really are important. And the U.S. truly does value those bonds. So that's something to think about. But also, just in a kind of more nuts and bolts way, what can the United States bring? What can we really do to help these countries develop their own economies so that they do become stronger? They are more independent. They're better able to sustain their own sovereignty and independence.
That was really interesting. I was listening with great interest the whole time. So thank you so much, Ambassador Spratlen. And I want to just take a moment to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which supports this program, Russia and its Neighbors, with Jill Dougherty, which we forgot to do at the outset. We usually do that quite conscientiously, but I was listening with great interest the whole time. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It was a delight to be here. Thank you to all the questioners. I'm so glad to know you had an audience that's interested in Central Asia. If anybody has not been to Central Asia, if you please find a way to go. It's a fascinating part of the world. You will be welcomed, and I think you will greatly enjoy it. If you have a chance to attend functions that are hosted and sponsored by the embassies of the Central Asian states around Washington or around the country, please take advantage of those as well. They're really delightful, wonderful people to get to know. You're muted, Jill. I can't hear you.
You got the closing word, Jill.
Yes, of course I'm muted. Thank you so much. It was a tour de force, really fantastic discussion. And I second the motion for traveling to the Central Asian countries. It's a fantastic place to visit. And Michael, thank you very much for all the help. And again, to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which we always appreciate. So come back. We have one more episode in December, which will kind of wrap things up. So please come back for that.